There is nothing more frightening than ignorance in action. That quote by Goethe sums up the strange relationship between religion and evidence. For thousands of years, people have believed without proof, trusted without verification, and defended without understanding. And even today, in an age when humanity can land robots on Mars and map the human genome, religion still expects us to believe ancient stories written in the age of candles and superstition, without question and without evidence. The first thing to understand is that religion doesn't just ignore evidence, it has to. It's built on the idea that belief is more virtuous than knowledge. Faith, by definition, is belief without proof. The moment you ask for evidence, you threaten the entire structure. That's why religious traditions often treat doubt as a moral flaw, instead of a sign of curiosity. Questioning becomes sin. Inquiry becomes rebellion. And so, people are taught to feel guilty for using the very tools that helped humanity rise above ignorance: observation, reason, and critical thinking. But the evidence against many religious claims isn't hidden or complicated. It's everywhere. The Earth isn't 6,000 years old. There was no global flood that wiped out all life except for one family on a boat. The sun doesn't stop in the sky. Humans didn't appear suddenly fully formed out of dust. Every major scientific discipline, geology, biology, astronomy, physics, contradicts the literal claims of religious texts. And the response from religion for centuries has been denial, reinterpretation, or silence. The story always changes only after the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. When science first began to challenge the old myths, religion didn't adapt. It resisted. Galileo was condemned for saying the Earth revolves around the sun. Darwin was mocked and demonized for showing that humans evolved from earlier life forms. The evidence was there, but religious authority clung to ancient texts as if human understanding had already reached perfection 2,000 years ago. Even now, in classrooms and political debates, some still argue that evolution is just a theory, not because they have counter-evidence, but because they fear what it means, that life can exist without divine design, that complexity doesn't need a creator. This fear of evidence isn't random. It's self-preservation. Religion claims certainty in areas where uncertainty is natural. It promises absolute truth in a world that's constantly revealing new layers of complexity. And when reality refuses to fit inside the story has to ignore reality. Because if evidence can overturn a belief, that belief was never divine. It was human. That's why religious apologetics often sound clever but never convincing. They twist logic to make contradictions sound profound. When prayers go unanswered, they call it God's plan. When good things happen, they call it God's blessing. When evil happens, it's mysterious ways. Every outcome is reinterpreted to protect the belief. No matter what the evidence says, the conclusion never changes. It's not truth-seeking. It's confirmation-seeking. Psychologically, this is understandable. Humans crave certainty, meaning, and belonging. Religion offers all three, neatly packaged and emotionally rewarding. It gives simple answers to complex questions and community support for believing them. But that comfort comes at a price, the sacrifice of intellectual honesty. The brain learns to defend beliefs instead of testing them. It stops asking, "Is this true?" and starts asking, "How can I keep believing this?" Over time, the ability to separate what feels true from what is true begins to fade. What's interesting is that most believers don't live as if their religious claims were literally true. Few people actually behave like they expect divine punishment for small sins or an eternal paradise for good deeds. Religious talk and real-life behavior rarely match. People go to doctors, not faith healers. They trust airplanes built by engineers, not priests. They check weather forecasts, not prophecies. On a practical level, everyone relies on evidence, except when it threatens their sacred ideas. So, religion ignores evidence not because the evidence is weak, but because evidence and faith are fundamentally incompatible. Evidence requires openness to being wrong. Faith requires the opposite, commitment to being right, even when the facts say otherwise. In a world where evidence leads medicine, technology and progress, religion stands apart as a relic of the age before proof mattered. It survives not by explaining reality, but by explaining away reality. And as we'll see, This conflict between belief and evidence doesn't just stay in philosophy. It affects how societies grow, how people think, and how truth itself is defined. If religion merely ignored evidence privately, it wouldn't be much of a problem. People could believe whatever they like, and the rest of the world could carry on guided by reason. But the trouble begins when belief demands authority, when tries to shape education, policy, and morality, all while rejecting the very evidence that keeps societies functional. Throughout history, evidence has always had to fight its way through the walls of faith. The church once dictated what people could read, what questions they could ask, and even what kind of cosmos they were allowed to imagine. When reality contradicted Scripture, it wasn't Scripture that changed. It was reality that had to be denied. That pattern hasn't disappeared. It's just evolved. Today, in some places, schools still teach creationism as an alternative to evolution. Laws are still influenced by religious dogma, not data. Moral discussions that could be informed by psychology, neuroscience, or ethics are instead filtered through verses written by people who thought epilepsy was demonic possession. The evidence for what promotes human well-being exists. It's in studies, experiments, and centuries of accumulated knowledge. But religion often insists that ancient texts already contain all moral truth, even when those texts justify slavery, sexism, and violence. That isn't moral insight, it's moral stagnation. And yet religion's resistance to evidence is rarely framed as rejection. It's disguised as humility. We can't know everything, believers say. Some things are beyond human understanding. It sounds modest, but it's not. It's a claim that ignorance is a form of wisdom, that refusing to follow the evidence is somehow noble. The problem isn't that some mysteries remain, it's that religion tries to fill those mysteries with certainty. When science says we don't know yet, religion says we already do, and it closes the door that curiosity had just opened. The irony is that this attitude doesn't protect truth, it protects power. When leaders claim divine authority, questioning them becomes blasphemy. Evidence becomes dangerous because it redistributes authority. It puts truth in the hands of anyone willing to observe and reason. Religion, on the other hand, concentrates it in the hands of a few who claim to speak for the divine. That's why, in so many cultures, the people most threatened by evidence aren't ordinary believers. They are the institutions that rely on belief to maintain control. Even on an individual level, this resistance to evidence shows up in subtle ways. When studies show that morality doesn't require belief in God, that non-believers are just as ethical and cooperative, the findings are ignored or dismissed. When archaeology contradicts the historical accuracy of sacred stories, the findings are reinterpreted or buried in theological excuses. When neuroscience shows that spiritual experiences can be reproduced through brain stimulation, it's brushed aside because it doesn't fit the narrative. The response is rarely to engage with the evidence. It's to protect the identity that depends on not engaging. This isn't about intelligence, it's about motivation. Cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable clash between belief and fact, is something every human experiences. But religion elevates it into virtue. To have faith is to silence the dissonance instead of resolving it. To ignore evidence becomes an act of loyalty, not blindness. The more the facts disagree, the more heroic the believer feels for holding on. In that way, faith rewards people for rejecting reality. It turns resistance to evidence into a moral badge. This is why discussions between believers and skeptics so often feel circular. When evidence contradicts a claim, the claim changes. When logic exposes an inconsistency, the explanation becomes metaphor. When morality evolves beyond Scripture, the text is said to be symbolic. Every contradiction becomes a reason to believe even harder. It's a self-repairing illusion, designed to survive contact with truth by endlessly reshaping itself around it. And yet the cracks are visible. The more humanity learns about the universe, the more those explanations shrink. Lightning isn't divine anger, it's atmospheric electricity. Disease isn't punishment, it's biology. The mind isn't a ghost in a body, it's a product of neurons and chemistry. Every step forward in understanding has been a step away from supernatural explanations. Religion doesn't fuel that progress, it trails behind it, adjusting its stories only when evidence makes denial impossible. Still, there's something profoundly human about this resistance. People don't ignore evidence because they love ignorance. They do it because evidence threatens meaning. For many, faith isn't about truth. It's about identity, belonging, and hope. Questioning a belief feels like questioning who they are. So they cling tighter, even as the ground beneath their ideas erodes. That's the tragedy of belief without evidence. It builds emotional homes on intellectual fault lines. But the good news is that the cracks don't just destroy, they let light in. Each generation that grows up with access to knowledge, free from fear of questioning, drifts further from blind faith. People learn that morality, purpose, and wonder don't depend on ancient myths. Evidence doesn't make life meaningless, it makes it honest. And honesty, though uncomfortable, is the beginning of real understanding. The question, then, isn't why religion ignores evidence. It's how long it can keep doing so before reality forces a reckoning. Not through punishment, but through progress. Every generation inherits two things: the knowledge discovered by those before them, and the beliefs left unchallenged. Progress happens when the first outweighs the second, and yet religion often works to keep the balance tilted toward tradition, not because it has evidence on its side, but because it has emotion. It understands that people will defend what comforts them even when it stops making sense. That's why, despite overwhelming scientific understanding, many still hold beliefs that collapse under minimal scrutiny. Fossil records, genetic evidence, cosmic background radiation, radiometric dating, these aren't opinions. They're data points converging on truths that religion once claimed to know differently. And each time evidence exposes an ancient error, religion doesn't apologize or admit defeat. It simply reinterprets, recasts, and rewrites. It moves. The goalpost from "this is literally true" to "it's metaphorical" or "it's a test of faith." The words change, but the evasion remains. There's a quiet dishonesty in that process. Not malicious necessarily, but strategic. Religion adapts just enough to survive, but never enough to surrender its authority. When the earth was proven round, the church learned to call the old passages symbolic. When the sun was shown to be the center, Scripture was said to be poetic. When evolution became undeniable, believers insisted it was guided by God. The story always shifts, but only after evidence leaves no choice. And yet, if truth were really sacred, religion wouldn't be dragged reluctantly toward it. It would lead the way. What makes this even more interesting is how selective the skepticism is. A person might demand proof for climate science, but none for miracles. They'll scrutinize peer-reviewed research, but accept ancient claims with zero verification. That's not critical thinking. That's motivated reasoning. Evidence isn't being weighed, it's being filtered. Anything that threatens the sacred is dismissed as just a theory, while anything that flatters the sacred is treated as fact. It's not about finding truth, it's about protecting comfort. This mindset affects more than personal belief. It shapes how societies evolve. When decision-making ignores evidence, harm follows. History is filled with examples: medicine, delayed by religious taboos; education censored by doctrine; human rights denied in the name of divine authority. Every time religion has insisted that belief outranks evidence, human suffering has been the cost. And every time reason pushed back, humanity advanced. Evidence gave us vaccines, electricity, clean water, and human rights rooted in empathy, not commandments. None of these required divine permission, only curiosity and courage. Religion often claims moral superiority, but morality that ignores evidence can't adapt. When data shows that compassion, education, and equality reduce violence and poverty, evidence becomes the true moral compass. Yet religious institutions still fight these findings when they conflict with scripture or tradition. Instead of asking, "What helps people thrive?" they ask, "What does our book say?" That's how faith turns good intentions into outdated systems that can't evolve with human understanding. Still, not all believers are blind to this conflict. Many quietly reinterpret their faith to coexist with evidence. They stop seeing their scriptures as literal history and start seeing them as cultural mythology, stories with human insight but not divine authority. This shift doesn't erase meaning, it refines it. It replaces obedience with understanding. And that's where something healthier begins. When belief no longer demands the rejection of evidence to survive. But the larger question remains, why should truth need defending? If something is real, evidence will show it. If something requires us to ignore reality to believe it, then belief isn't a virtue. It's a trap. Religion tells people that certainty is strength, but certainty without proof is fragility disguised as faith. The stronger stance is not to cling to what feels right, but to adjust when evidence shows otherwise. That's the courage religion often mistakes for arrogance. The beauty of evidence is that it doesn't care who you are or what you hope is true. It doesn't need worship. It doesn't require loyalty. It just waits, patiently, for those who want to know rather than believe. And that's what separates honest inquiry from dogma. Inquiry changes with new information. Dogma never does. Religion, by ignoring evidence, traps itself in a story that can't evolve, while the world around it keeps evolving anyway. The irony is that reality is far more awe-inspiring than any holy book. The universe doesn't need divine permission to be beautiful. The laws of physics, the complexity of biology, the vastness of space, these aren't lesser wonders because they're natural. They're greater because they're real. Evidence doesn't make existence cold or meaningless. It makes it understandable. It replaces fear with clarity, and myth with genuine wonder. One day, perhaps, religion will stop treating evidence as an enemy and see it for what it is, a path to truth that doesn't need faith to be fulfilling. Until then, the tension will remain, belief demanding certainty and reality demanding honesty. The choice between them defines not just what we believe, but what kind of species we become. Because truth doesn't vanish when ignored. It waits. And it always outlasts the stories that fear it.